But the tide of royal encroachment had set in at this time with a flood too full and boisterous to be effectually repressed by the efforts of the Assembly. By a succession of civil enactments, of which one passed in 1594 was so illegal that even Sir George Mackenzie condemns it, the king contrived to acquire the patronage of the churches which had escaped this servitude at the Reformation. In a few years, by a course of which it is difficult to say whether the arbitrary violence or nefarious duplicity is more to be execrated, James accomplished the darling object at which he had been so studiously aiming. Men favorable to his views were nominated to parishes as they became vacant. Royal influence silently leavened the church with unfaithfulness, till presbytery was abolished by the votes of assemblies, from which public virtue seems to have almost entirely fled. Episcopacy was restored, and the clergy, at the bidding of an Erastian king, consummated their infamy by forging their own chains. Is there no lesson here for the instruction of posterity? Are we to be deaf forever to the voice of Providence, which thus, in the evolution of human affairs, thunders eloquent condemnation of the sin of permitting the slightest vestige of Erastianism and patronage is Erastianism to pollute the precincts of Zion? Was it not retribution on a sinful compromise with this plague spot, which the early reformers in the cruel exigency of their position were forced to spare, when it spread and festered till the whole church was tainted, diseased, and dead? And thus, at the opening of the 17th century, Zion was suffering, and suffering justly, a twofold punishment in the fact that while she wept by the streams of Babel, the Canaanite lived at ease in the land of promise. To whatever system of state policy, to whatever collateral influences, the downfall of the goodly structure, reared by the labors of Knox and preserved so long by the firmness of Melville, may be ascribed, patronage was a manifest instrument in effecting it. Another lesson from history corroborates our assertion that patronage and thraldom are synonymous terms. It served a second time to introduce prelacy. In 1638, the light of the divine countenance had again fallen on the Scottish Church. A Second Reformation had commenced. Godliness revived in our land. By what energy of purpose, by what intrepid resolution, by what patriotism, holier than earthly ties can foster, for its flame was lighted at the altar of God. The reformers of 1638 achieved deliverance from the bondage of episcopacy. Under this the land had groaned since 1606, is matter of familiar history. With the blessing of God crowning their efforts, our nation enjoyed once more the sweets of civil and religious liberty. Patronage, among other evils, was removed, and Presbyterianism, in vigorous and unthwarted operation, diffused its healthful influences through our land. The hopes of the reformers were, however, doomed to a sad reversal, and the fabric which they had erected to a sudden overthrow. Charles II was restored, and scarcely had he reascended the throne of his ancestors when with matchless perfidy, the whole work of the Reformation was destroyed, and the wise legislation of preceding years cancelled with a rapidity that astonished the actors themselves in the iniquitous drama. The patronage was not forgotten. Its utility as an engine for the accomplishment of despotic ends was too well known. In the very first Parliament which Charles convened, royal sanction was given to patronage, and in 1662, scarcely 2 years after the Restoration, another act was passed. That act, Parliament 1, Act 36, and Parliament 1, Session 2, Act 3, according to which every minister was interdicted from lifting his stipend, unless in the course of that year he obtained a presentation from the patron, as well as a coalition from the bishop of the diocese in which he lived. Nor were the minions of the king content that this presentation should for the future be necessary in the appointment of ministers. The act was retrospective. It obliged those who were already in the full exercise of the pastoral office to comply with the Erastian mandate or forfeit their living. Nearly 400 ministers chose the latter alternative and suffered the loss of all things. Quote, "By which means," says Brown of Wamfrey, "there were some 100 of parishes left destitute, and the shepherds were scattered up and down the land, seeking a shelter place for themselves. It was a sad and lamentable sight to see, the sad farewell betwixt the loving pastor and his beloved flock, and the tears, the cries, and the bitter groans that were there. Now were the breasts pulled from the mouths of the young infants, the table was drawn, and the people were made to wander up and down the mountains, seeking the word of the Lord, and could not find it. They had silent Sabbaths and empty pulpits." Unquote. The faithfulness of these heroic men was yet more severely tried during the long years of positive persecution which followed. Blood flowed like water. Scotland became in Alcedama, and the cloud of the divine displeasure thickening over an apostate kingdom darkened each hour into a deeper shade the sackcloth of the witness. How instructive the fact that the restoration of patronage was the ominous prelude of these disasters, among the first steps in the course of complicated and consummate depravity on which Charles had so recklessly embarked. And may no truth be gleaned from the connection here signified between patronage and prelacy? Another leaf from authentic history, and we close this historical proof of the inconsistency of patronage with the spiritual freedom of Christ's kingdom. It was modified to a certain extent at the Revolution. The provisions of the Act in 1690, by which Protestant heritors, though unconnected with the Church, were permitted to cooperate in the nomination of ministers, we cannot but condemn. The Act in itself was an unauthorized interference by the civil magistrate with things clearly beyond his province, and in the provision referred to, it invested certain parties with religious privileges by a civil tenure. Such, however, was the condition of the Scottish Established Church for some years. At length, in the reign of Queen Anne, a plot was laid for the restoration of the popish dynasty of the Stuarts, and for this purpose prelacy must again be re-established, and that prelacy might be re-established, it was deemed indispensable to revive the law of patronage. Such was the practical sorites which the Jacobites determined to enact. In evidence of this statement, among other MS letters preserved by Woodrow, there is one addressed to an Episcopalian in 1708 by a Jacobite who had been once a bishop. The letter explicitly declares, quote, "The matter must first be sounded at a distance, and a just computation of our strength made, and some previous settlement made, such as restoring of patronage, and the granting of indulgence, with liberty to possess churches and benefices. And this will undoubtedly make way for an entire reestablishment of the ancient and apostolic order of bishops." Unquote. More evidence might be adduced, but the fact that the revival of patronage formed part of Bolingbroke's devices for restoring the Pretender will scarcely be questioned by anyone at all acquainted with the history of the period. It is not an instructive circumstance that on the 3 occasions on which patronage was imposed on the Church, it was directly or indirectly with the view of paving the way for palatic usurpations. Nay more, one end contemplated on all these occasions was the subversion of our civil liberties too. Is the inference wrong that patronage and presbytery are antagonistic elements? It is sometimes said, in extenuation of the tardy and temporizing steps by which this grievance has been sought within recent years, not to be destroyed but mitigated in the establishment of this country, that a patron merely ushers a presentee to the door of a church court and leaves him there, so that after all little deprivation of its privileges is experienced by the Church through the existence of this civil right of the patron. It is not true. And here a footnote. On this point, keenly litigated in the present controversy, the 16th and 17th sections of Park's learned work against patronage may be consulted with profit. Having spoken of what the patron does in the nomination of a presentee, he adds, quote, "All that is here left in the Church's power being, indeed, nothing else but simply to find and declare whether the person elected by the patron be sufficient, and that only in so far as concerns the merely external qualifications that are simply necessary by the letter of the Church laws for the office of a pastor in general." Unquote. With regard to the circumstance whether he, quote, "be fit and proper for the particular charge of such and such a people," unquote, Park proceeds to state, quote, "Though the Church, as she is bound, should enter upon these further considerations, and thereupon find cause to reject the person presented by the patron, yet her determinations therein would not be regarded as being absolutely inconsistent with the exercise of the privilege of patronage." Unquote. We submit these extracts because they are not liable to the suspicion with which, by certain minds, any statement to the same effect from a dissenter is sure to be regarded. And we would avail ourselves of this opportunity to make earnest protestation that if in any point our views have come into collision with those entertained by the supporters of the people's rights in the establishment, it is from no delight to be found in opposition to them, and far less from any desire to serve the cause of the men against whom they are arrayed. Our church has been accused of abetting moderatism, because we have on some occasions held the members of that party constitutionally right, though scripturally wrong. The error is as gross as if we had been charged with supporting popery, because we had sought to convince Pascal that some of his tenets were totally incompatible with the fundamental articles of his church and the genius of its creed. Without waiting to consider whether or not church courts and the establishment have the power claimed by them of rejecting a presentee, if a majority of male heads of families in the parish dissent, should we even concede, for the sake of the argument, that they are left in the full enjoyment of this power by statute, what follows? Is the church free, no one taking an enlarged view of the indirect consequences resulting from the operation of patronage, foreseeing that the present revival in the establishment may be blighted by the concerted opposition of patrons pledged to nominate such licentiates only as are favorable to their interests? No one taking these elements into consideration can deny that this grievance, mitigate and modify it as you please with 1,000 regulations, is inconsistent in effect as well as theory with the freedom of the church. Bolingbroke and his associates were no such raw tyros in legislation as the contrary view implies. If patronage then in any form is opposed to the independence of Christ's kingdom, the rights of its head and the liberties of its subjects, if it is incompatible with the free spirit of presbytery, if it arose in popish superstition, if it has ever been introduced for the advancement of prelatic usurpations, if civil liberty has been lost by it already, and in some unforeseen, indeed, but not therefore impossible crisis of national affairs, may be injured by it again, why should not this root of bitterness utterly and without delay be extirpated from the vineyard of the Lord?